G'day comrades, welcome to the Mind in 1500 Words, New Papers in Consciousness Studies, Episode 3. Raccah, Block and Fox, 2021. Does the prefrontal cortex play an essential role in consciousness? Insights from intracranial electrical stimulation of the human brain in Journal of Neuroscience, Volume 41, Issue 10, page 2076 to 2087. Today we're looking at a review paper of the sort that commonly appears in psychology journals. You know the sort, the kind that looks at quite a lot of studies, but just draws out the key findings from them, rather than walking through the justification for those findings. I'm not typically a fan of this kind of paper. I find it more convincing when a paper explains the justification for the findings and conclusions for each reviewed study, but others seem to find such papers irritatingly long. Personally, I find it longer to chase up every cited study to see if I should believe the review. So, why have I chosen this paper? Well, the problem is less pronounced for this paper than others, because all the reviewed studies use the same kind of experimental approach. But more importantly, the reasoning around the theoretical significance of these studies is interesting and important. This is one of those reviews that we all should make the time to read. Set it for one of your reading groups, if you're not being bullied by your institution to stop that sort of thing. The question the paper has is about the importance of the prefrontal cortex for consciousness. Unlike a lot of neuroscience papers, which merely look at correlations between blood flow to particular brain regions and tasks, this review looks at studies that involve direct stimulation of the brain, and which could, in principle, justify causal or constitutive claims. I'll come back to that distinction in a bit. The studies Raccah and colleagues review follow a general approach to experimental work. If we want to know if one variable makes a difference to another, we interfere with the first variable and see what happens. If we want to know if activity in a particular part of the brain makes a difference to subject's experience, we interfere with that part of the brain and see what happens, i.e., get the subject to tell us what they're experiencing. The studies Raccah and colleagues are interested in use a technique called intracranial electrical stimulation, which involves the application of charge through an electrode to increase activity in a particular part of the brain. As you can imagine, this technique involves surgery, so it isn't used very much, and only with people who need surgery for some other reason, often related to epilepsy. There's a couple of things to say here, which are not so much objections as questions to the authors. The first is about the kind of consciousness they're interested in. They say at the start that they're interested in phenomenal consciousness, in particular what it is like to have an experience. However, the way this is operationalized in all the studies they review is to ask the subject what they're experiencing, and these reports are all of the content of the experience. We'll see some later, but it's stuff like, I'm seeing a face, and not things that could allow us to map out similarity between different experiences. Related to this, the theories being tested against the reviewed studies are the global workspace theory and the higher order thought theory, both of which I think are better characterized as theories of awareness rather than phenomenal qualities. I'd be interested in knowing if Raccah et al. Think that explaining awareness of a particular content is sufficient to explain the phenomenal qualities of that experience, particularly because one of the authors is Block, and he's argued elsewhere for a distinction between cognitive access, which is rather like awareness, and phenomenology. The second point of interest here is one that Raccah and colleagues themselves raise. They say they are interested in the constituents of consciousness, i.e., what brain activity constitutes an experience. However, as they point out, intracranial electrical stimulation can't distinguish between the constituents and causes of experience. Suppose we use an electrode to activate part of the prefrontal cortex. Suppose after this the subject reports seeing a face. This would happen if we happen to elicit activity that constitutes an experience of a face, or if it elicited activity that caused the experience, say by causing activity elsewhere in the brain. I'm convinced by their reasoning that this technique can't distinguish these options, but I'd be interested to know what sort of evidence they think could distinguish causes from constituents. So much for my questions. Let's have a look at Raccah and colleagues' argument. There's a couple of reasons to look at the role of the PFC in consciousness. The first is empirical. There are studies which have associated PFC activity measured through imaging techniques with consciousness. The more interesting reason for us is that there are some theories of consciousness which hypothesize that some PFC activity constitutes consciousness, or if they don't do so explicitly, that hypothesis follows fairly naturally from other theoretical commitments. Raccah and colleagues argued that this follows from two classes of theory of consciousness: global workspace theories and higher order thought theories. Both of these are process or functionalist theories of consciousness, that is, they identify consciousness with a particular set of cognitive processes, those processes that make a representation globally available, or those that create higher order thought, i.e. the thought that I am having such and such an experience. Such processes are associated with the PFC in other work. However, the predictions here are not so simple as applying electricity to the PFC should cause some experience. Raccah and colleagues consider a couple of versions of the higher order thought approach and the global workspace approach. In common between these accounts, they argue, is the hypothesis that perceptual content is represented in the sensory cortices, e.g. in the striate cortex for vision. There can be multiple such contents, several of which might be stably represented over time, e.g. when looking at a bistable image or in a binocular rivalry experiment. The processes that constitute consciousness of that content are instantiated in the PFC. Think of a binocular rivalry experiment in which each eye is presented separately with a different image, e.g. a face and a house. As we know, subjects report that what they see isn't these images overlapping, but rather an alternating sequence of them. These theories of consciousness explain this by positing that both the house and the face are stably represented in the striate cortex, but in a sequence they are accessed by the processes that constitute consciousness, which are instantiated in the PFC. When we interfere with the PFC, according to these theories, we are not changing perceptual content, but rather changing how that content is processed in consciousness. Thus, Raccah and colleagues reason we should predict from these theories that stimulating the PFC will disrupt consciousness, changing the subject's experience to a warped form of whatever they are currently perceiving, and not give an entirely new content. Raccah and colleagues say these accounts do not predict that stimulating the PFC should cause hallucinations. Only stimulation of the sensory cortex should do that. Again, there are questions to be asked about this. Given the amount of connections from the PFC leading back to the sensory cortices, why shouldn't stimulation of the PFC change activity in those areas, thus producing what would, for Raccah and colleagues, count as a hallucination? I think from reading their description of intracranial electrical stimulation that they may respond here that we just don't know enough about how activity from such stimulation spreads to know that this is a viable option, which is fair enough, but by the same token, I'm not convinced that it's ruled out. Nonetheless, for Raccah and colleagues, we will have good support for global workspace and higher order thought theories if stimulation of at least some of the PFC alters experience, but does not add new content to that experience. Let's turn to the review. What did they find? As they suggest, highly equivocal results. On their analysis, stimulating the PFC is less likely to change experience than stimulation to other parts of the brain, with direct stimulation of the anterior PFC resulting in the fewest changes, and direct stimulation of the sensory cortices resulting in the most. However, given their reasoning, it's not the number of changes so much as the nature of the changes that we really want to know about. There are reports in the reviewed studies of what seem to be hallucinations resulting from stimulation of the left lateral PFC, with one subject saying, quote, "All of a sudden, it seems as if many things are coming at me. I can hardly see them. At the same time, a church, a castle, a big room," end quote. However, the subjects in this study also made statements describing their experiences, which suggest that the stimulation produced ideas of such things rather than visual experiences. This same subject, for example, described the experience as like, quote, "thoughts coming all at once," end quote. The reports here seem pretty ambiguous, at times coming across as a report of a sensory hallucination, at others coming across as an idea, although the authors of the original study, that's Blanca et al., favoured the hallucination interpretation. Other studies of stimulation of the left lateral PFC suggests this technique doesn't cause sensory hallucinations, e.g. one subject reported the idea of a person but was unable to describe any visual features. However, a different study, this time of activation of the right ventral lateral PFC, suggests that stimulation of this part of the PFC causes sensory experiences. One subject reported seeing faces and was able to describe and compare their visual features. However, Raccah and colleagues suggest that this stimulation may actually be disturbing the subject's sensory experience rather than creating an entirely new one, because once, when viewing an experimenter's face, the subject said, quote, "It is as if your face was transformed, one time without glasses, once with a hat, but always the same face," end quote. And, quote, "It was as if you changed your face, that it was remodeled, and that it became another face, and so forth," end quote. These reports seem to fit nicely with the predictions Raccah and colleagues argue follow from things like higher-order thought theory and global workspace theory. However, there are a couple of problems here. The first is that this subject also reported experiences of faces when looking at things other than faces. The other is that this distinction between sensory hallucination and perturbed experience or idea isn't as secure as Raccah and colleagues suppose. Dennett's famous argument about the lack of a distinction between Orwellian and Stalinesque revisions to perceptual content could be applied here, or even just the difficulties in distinguishing confabulations from experiences. Those are separate papers, not considered by Raccah and colleagues, so I won't belabor the point here, but an advocate of global workspace or higher-order thought theory, armed with those arguments, could make the case that the ambiguity of the reports obtained from these studies is what is expected from their theories. Continuing their review, Raccah and colleagues turn to studies that suggest that usually stimulation of the PFC doesn't cause changes to experience. They couldn't find any studies which reported changes to experience due to stimulation of the anterior-medial PFC. Stimulation of the orbitofrontal cortex, in contrast, sometimes is reported to be associated with hallucinations, particularly feelings in the body. It also can cause memory recall and emotional experiences. However, citing one of their own studies, led by Fox, they point out that stimulation of only 17% of the sites within the OFC led to any changes to experience at all. Again, the more forward they went, the fewer effects on experience were reported. Turning to the anterior cingulate cortex, they remind us of some well-known results showing that stimulation of a part of this area results in the urge to move. They also cover studies that report vestibular, that is, orientation, sensations, and a variety of motor effects. One study they focus on resulted in some really cool reports of feelings of determination and resilience, e.g., quote, "I feel like I have to fight it, I have to make it through," end quote. Other effects on emotion are reported for stimulation of different parts of the anterior cingulate cortex. Summing all this up, they say, quote, "The specific nature of most effects, whether visceral, somatic, olfactory, or emotional, as well as the lack of effects on ongoing perception, contradicts the notion that the PFC has a general role in rendering existing perceptual representations conscious," end quote. In other words, they think they found at best only occasional support for the idea that processes in the PFC, be they global broadcasting or higher order thought making, makes content in the sensory cortices conscious. Overall, they suggest that most of the time, stimulation of various parts of the PFC doesn't affect consciousness at all. Does this conclusion stand up? I think it's well reasoned, but not entirely convincing. In particular, I think the advocate of a global workspace or higher order thought theory could point to a couple of issues in Raccah and colleagues' argument. The first being that they don't deal with potential effects of recurrent processing, that is, of effects from the PFC on the sensory cortices. The other being that the predictions of the theories aren't well specified enough to be tested against the reviewed data. In particular, if we take into account the difficulty or impossibility of distinguishing in confabulation and experience, and or Dennett's argument against the distinction between Orwellian and Stalinesque revisions, then we don't get a firm distinction between what Raccah and colleagues call disrupted experience and hallucination. it may still be possible to show that these theories, higher order thought and global workspace, are consistent with all of the findings reviewed by Raccah and colleagues. That said, I still think there is an important argument here, and you should definitely read the paper. With thanks, I'll talk to you next time with more in the developmental series.